Thank you for having me here. So my name is Oleksandr. I'm a PhD student at Tallinn University, and I'm going to present a paper which is called Towards Set of Principles for Enhancing Open Cultural Data Reusability in Educational Context. And so starting from the definition of what open data is data that can be freely used, reused, and redistributed by anyone, subject only at most requirement to attribute and share alike. It's a definition from the Open Data Handbook, and I would also like to mention here that attribution here means that the origins of data sets should be specified, that the data set is to be reutilized further, and share alike here means that the licensing should be not more restrictive than the original data set. But essentially, moving on to the transition from open data in general to the open cultural data. So open data in general can be divided into two broad categories. So this is the open government data and the open cultural data. So essentially, open government data is data which is coming from the governmental institutions. For example, data regarding the crime rates in certain geographical locations. That could be one case. And the open cultural data is the data which is stored and is originating from the GLAM institutions. It's an acronym that stands for galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And examples of that would be, for example, digitized maps which are stored in the museums, or all the archaeological artifacts that are extracted and the digitized versions of them also stored in the digital archives. That would be the open cultural data. And moving on to the research goals of the paper. So overall, we were trying to kind of tackle different two things here. First of all, identify the existing principles which are relevant, which pertain to the open cultural data, and the principles which could govern the basically the utilization of the open cultural data, and also analyze whether those principles covering the discoverability, meaning that if the end user is actually possible to find the open data, open cultural data, and utilize it further for their personal goals. And then moving on to what cultural data reuse practically means. So the cultural data reuse can be divided into two broad categories. One would be the physical reuse, and that's when the artifacts from the basically digital realm are moving into the physical one. An example of that would be that digital artifacts, so the cultural heritage artifacts are used as the inspiration for some kind of handicrafts. For example, if there is some kind of famous painting that would be utilized on the laptop case, and that would be printed, and that would be the reutilization. And the example of digital reuse would be the utilization of the open cultural data and the third-party solutions. And one good example of that would be the usage in massive open online courses. So in the abandonment, for example, of digital maps and the history-related massive open online courses. Moving on to the next slide. So the open cultural data in education is predominantly regarding the digital usage, and that's basically the integration of cultural data into various applications, various third-party services. And examples of that would be massive open online courses, educational apps. That can be also done in the serious games, so the artifacts can be embedded and used within the gameplay, and of course the lesson materials. And it should also note here that it's crucial to ensure the interoperability for the government services, because if the open cultural data is not interchangeable, and if it's not possible for it to have it embedded, then the integration wouldn't really happen. Moving on to the methodology of the paper. So our research was essentially desk research. In the first stage, we identified the relevant principles using the essentially that can be relevant for the open cultural data. Afterwards, those existing principles were analyzed and the gaps were identified, and the proposals and the improvement suggestions, which are the result of this analysis stage, they were utilized and they were applied in the Estonian cultural data landscape to identify whether they would be applicable and what suggestions could be made. So covering the data governance principles in general, during the research, we were able to identify three sets of principles which are relevant in this case. First one would be the open data and the principles from the open definition. Those are four principles and they're relevant for all open data in general. Then it would be FAIR principles, which are relevant for scientific data specifically. And finally, the open GLAM, open galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, the work group, and they generated 5 principles which are relevant specifically for the open cultural data. And below you can also see the examples of the principles. So for example, the OpenGLAM, one of the principles states that that publishing data should use the open file formats which are machine readable. So the formats which are not readable should not be essentially utilized and should not go further. Based on the analysis of the existing principles, we specified certain enhancements and certain principles which can be used to enhance the data usage. Those principles are divided into 4 groups. Just go briefly over them. So there is a access group, and that covers so the main tool for that would be the data portal. And the point here is that data should be uploaded on the publicly available portal, and that's how the access to the open cultural data can be enabled. Then the use case of finding data tool for that would be metadata. So that means that metadata should be realized and should comprehensively describe the data sets. And if metadata is not of sufficient quality and completeness, then the data set could not be found. And the third use case is retrieval, and that covers, and the tools for that would be enablement of APIs, applied programming interfaces, and also machine readability and open format. So the point here is that data should be ideally available via the API, and that's how the interaction and integration with third-party services could take place. And finally, the realization, and the key tool here is the declaration of the data licenses and the specification of licenses, because if the usage conditions are not specified on the data set, it's hard to utilize it further. And essentially, the proposed set of principles were applied to the Estonian data landscape. I'll just go briefly over the existing systems. In Estonia, there exists a VARM, which is essentially a high-level data, open cultural data aggregator, which stores metadata from a variety of other systems. And then there are 3 distinct kind of strands of systems. So there is a museum information system, which holds all the data from the museums in digitalized format. Well, that's being digitized. Then there are several subsystems from the national archives. They are built based on the data that's stored in there. So, for example, Photos has pictures, and alt images, and Carded has alt maps, and the digitalized maps from, I think, dating back to the 17th century. And then there is also a set of systems for the National Library. And based on the application of the proposed principles, we were able to identify several pitfalls. So first of all, there is a complete lack of APIs, meaning that although data is available on the portals, it can't really be, like, it's not quite machine readable, and it can't be interacted and integrated in the other services. Then another problem is the single object download. So for example, the alt maps and the pictures, they're downloadable one by one, and there is no approach to have them embedded or downloaded at bulk. And then for subsystems, for certain systems for National Library, the other problem is that there is a need for pre-registration. So if a user doesn't have the state credentials, then they can't even access those systems. And that goes against the open data definition and principle. And based on those results of application to the Estonian data landscape, we also identified some specific implications and specific improvement suggestions. So in terms of access, it's important to ensure the comprehensive access. So the data aggregator portal, which is environment, should store all the digitized data, not just certain subsets. Then in terms of finding the data, the metadata should be complete, and there should be requirement for the minimal set of metadata which describes the object. Because if that's not in place, then it's quite hard to find the relevant artifacts. In terms of retrieval, the key gap here is the lack of APIs, and it's important to embed and implement the APIs for the further data reuse and integration. And finally, for the utilization, the license for the data set should be, and for the open cultural data should be a specific mandatory metadata field, and that should be specified in all cases, because otherwise the reusage is also not quite possible. And finally, moving on to the limitations. So first of all, the problem is the incomprehensive scope of the study, because we applied it only on the Estonian landscape. It would be good to take a couple of other countries and examine if that's applicable there. Then there is a lack of well-defined measurements. There is no way to quantify those gaps. And for example, say that if the country systems have a grade of 5, then everything is fine. So the quantifiability is not present. And finally, the other annotation is the kind of generic nature of suggestions. Perhaps more case studies will be needed in the future. And that would be pretty much all from my side. Thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, please ask.
Okay, thank you, Oleksandr. We have time for questions. When in this time of pandemic, there many heritage artifacts were digitized, but with such digitalization, it also can bring threats to accuracy and misleading information. So I would like to know if you could briefly share your perspective on that. How can we prevent that? If we should rely on expertise knowledge to validate that information, or crowd validation, the wisdom of the crowds would be a way to validate this information provided?
Yes, I would say it's a really good point. First of all, yes, you are correct. I guess there can be some crowdsourcing initiatives, as for example, for the recognition of text, so there can be a power of crowd utilized to make sure that artifacts are accurate. And then I guess another option would be to have the metadata schema, so data that describes the data. That could be also like used to double check that everything is correct. But yes, I would say that crowdsourcing would be really helpful here.
Okay. Thank you. Any further questions?